All right, good morning, folks. Welcome to Coffee with Artists. My name is Rachel Wilkins. I am the co-founder of Conception Arts. Delighted to be joined this morning by really the true definition of a multifaceted artist, Brian Alessandro. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, Rachel, thank you for having me today.
So, Brian, where are you joining us from this morning? Tell us a little about your current quarantine situation.
So my husband and I live in Chinatown, New York, and about 2 months ago we came out to his mother's house in Roselle Park, New Jersey, and we've been kind of hunkering down here ever since. So I'm in the guest bedroom of my house in Roselle Park, New Jersey.
So we were talking a little bit before we jumped on about the idea of being creative in these times. I think folks are either feeling very, very creative and inspired to just kind of hunker down and get some ideas out, or people are feeling the exact opposite. There's no kind of middle road right now. Tell me how it's been going for you.
So I've been finding that as well. I run a literary journal called The New Engagement. We're about to celebrate 4 years this summer, and we've been pitching stories to a lot of writers and artists throughout the last month or two to see if they would want to write about their quarantine experiences or viral pandemics in general, or disease in general, or isolation in general. And half of them say that they're completely stunted, that they're not able to work at all. Others say they're feeling especially productive, and they've been submitting copious amounts of work to us. I myself have been in an extremely hyper productive mode, and I don't know if that's just good old fashioned sublimation, because I'm on some level a little bit nervous and depressed about all of this. So I find that creativity has always been a reliable outlet for me. And I started drawing this, what I call a quarantine series, about 3 weeks ago. It's a series of 7 illustrations that feature figures with N95 masks engaging in everyday activities, from drinking at a bar to having a picnic to trying to get on with their life while, operating within this new normal. I'm also editing a short film that I shot in February called A Saintly Madness, and I'm writing a feature-length screenplay based on that concept. And I also continue to write for Interview Magazine and Newsday. I write interviews for Interview, and I write book reviews for Newsday.
So you're definitely busy.
Yes. I also have a day job, I should mention.
What is the day job?
It's completely remote. I do quality assurance for a support coordination firm in New Jersey that serves people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's completely remote. So I'm able
I was going to ask, where do you find the hours in the day to do all of these things?
My husband gets mad at me because I'm always working. We'll be binging something on Netflix, but I'll be there with my laptop or my pen and paper and drawing or editing or writing something while watching a show. He's like, how are you understanding anything that's happening on the show if you're not actually watching it? I like to have it as background white noise.
I can relate to that 100%. So, we talked about you being multifaceted. You're a published author. You are a fiction writer, filmmaker, playwright, editor of this fabulous magazine. Yes. What would you say, besides you, obviously being the common denominator, what is the common thread throughout all of these different forms of expression in terms of your creativity?
I think that from a very early age, I've always been very curious about how my personal misgivings with the world resonate with the world itself at large. So I've always been very fascinated by the public and the private, the personal and the social, the sort of the petty and the profound, all these dichotomies, right? The sacred and the profane, and how sort of my point of view or my experiences could ever be of any value to a larger consumptive culture. And I think that often, like I said earlier, I do wrestle with certain anxieties and depression for my entire adult life and into my childhood too. And I just find that drawing or writing or filmmaking serves as a conduit even more effectively than medication ever had or psychotherapy ever had. It's sort of exercising as like a kind of a catharsis. It's been really useful and consistent, and it's served. And so it's something that I've really stuck with. And I don't know if I ever really made a conscious choice of I'm going to be a filmmaker, I'm going to be an illustrator, I'm going to be a writer. These are things that I just sort of started to do when I was a teenager and stuck with it, and sort of developed my craft and my ability to express more precisely, and yet at the same time also more ambiguously, which I think is when it gets really interesting too.
Mm.
As I've gotten older, so 25 plus years now, I've been at these three professions.
So tell me about the return to drawing during this time, because I haven't seen any visual artwork from you in a long time, and then these images started to pop up and they were fantastic. So tell us about that return. Have you been creating in between or just not putting it out there?
I think because I've been working on the script, I've been working on the short film, and I've been working on all of the articles for Newsday and Interview, that I needed something to help bridge the chasms, and also to help me just sort of recenter. Drawing has always been the most meditative art form for me. It's whenever I had writer's block, I would draw. Whenever I was studying for an exam when I was in college or graduate school, I would draw. It was always the sort of mechanism that helped calm me down and help me focus. And I think if you look back on my life, it's always been periods during great social unrest where I've done the most drawing, right after 9/11. Right after the tsunami. I was in Thailand when the tsunami happened in 2004. I was in Bangkok, so I was pretty far from Phuket, and we were safe, but I was still in the region. After the economic recession, the 2008 downturn, after Donald Trump became president, those are periods during which, yet another national tragedy, those are periods during which I've done sort of the most drawing. And again, because it serves as a kind of like a tranquilizer.
So in that case, do you find yourself challenged creatively when you are perhaps in a more content state?
That's a good question. I think that's fair. I think I need, Stanley Kubrick once said that making a film, for example, was like trying to write War and Peace while on a roller coaster. And and I agree with that. Filmmaking is more like trying to paint the Mona Lisa while in a thunderstorm, really. And so, yeah, I do think that a certain amount of stress and activity and anything that's sort of unnerving or disquieting helps get me to do the work. I don't know if that's defensive, if it's a means of diversion, or if it's just something that helps me relate to whatever is going on in the country or in the world or in my life too. I think that when my dad was sick, and certainly when he passed, I did a good deal of writing, creative writing. I think maybe the personal losses or the personal stressors compel me to write, whereas the sort of sociocultural ones make me want to draw.
It's interesting. Yeah. So you grew up in the New York metropolitan area. You grew up in Queens. You were born in the Bronx.
I was.
What was some of the advantages and some of the challenges of growing up next to such a vibrant, bustling city?
I don't know if there were any disadvantages, but certainly what was advantageous was growing up in a neighborhood like Whitestone, Queens, which was right on the border of Flushing, sort of sandwiched between the Bronx and Flushing. And so it was an incredible cultural melting pot. And Queens is like the most culturally diverse region in the entire world. So to have such exposure at such an early age to so many different cultures, I think served my desire to want to be creative and explore and relate to.
So, as you were growing up, you ultimately went to Ivy League school, Columbia, to get a master's in clinical psychology. Mm-hmm. How has that education informed your creative practice?
So when the time came for me to graduate college and consider what I was going to do beyond that, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and I was torn between journalism, clinical psychology, and creative writing. I actually got into the journalism school at Columbia, and I went for a week. And then I left in favor of the MA in clinical psychology. I left because it felt so corporate, and I don't think I was expecting that. And it kind of turned me off, and it felt like I was getting an MBA, and I was not interested in that. It was the wrong avenue. And I decided not to get my MFA because I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of criticism for saying this, but I feel like very many MFA programs, at least insofar as creative writing is concerned, within the United States, does create a kind of a homogenized voice. And I didn't want that. It probably would have been the more pragmatic thing to do, because a lot of the professors offer direct pipelines to literary agencies and to publishing houses and to literary journals. So it probably would have sped my career up 10 or 15 years sooner. I took the more arduous route, as it were, by getting an MA in clinical psychology. I mean, number one, psychology is another passion of mine. And number two, I felt like it would have been a really great tool to sort of mining the human psyche. If you're going to write for and about people, it's really important to know people. And I thought, well, what better profession than psychology to give me that advantage? And it has on some level.
And you mentioned kind of the pipeline to opportunities, but do you feel that perhaps mixing in certain circles in New York almost gives you that without going to get an MFA anyway?
Yes, absolutely. Fortunately and unfortunately, I arrived into that scene 25 years later. It's really only been the last couple of years that I found myself at home within the New York literary scene, and that's when I befriended wonderful authors like Edmund White and Michael Carroll and Colm Toybin and Zadie Smith and Christopher Bolin, and they've been incredibly generous and helpful and kind. And I adapted. I guess I could say this now. I spent the last 3 years adapting into a graphic novel, Edmund White's most famous novel, A Boy's Own Story, which was published in 1982 by Random House. It'll be released probably this Christmas. I didn't do the illustrations, but I wrote the script. So we had an incredible artist named Igor Karash, who did the illustrations, and he's actually still refining his work. His stuff looks like Edward Hopper, and I'm not exaggerating. I can't wait to share it with everybody, but it'll be published by Top Shelf Production.
What is it adapted into? I'm sorry, say it again.
A graphic novel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
So you mentioned some of the folks that you've been getting to know here, but who are your creative heroes? Who's been kind of the biggest influences on your career?
Living or
either?
Probably Stanley Kubrick, filmmaker. He's probably the reason why I write or want to make films. Pier Paolo Pasolini. I love John Cassavetes, Ingmar Bergman. And for writers, Vladimir Nabokov, Virginia Woolf. Contemporary, I mean, I'm a big fan of Zadie Smith's work. She's wonderful. Joan Didion, Mary Gateskill, Joy Williams. There's so many, it's hard for me to name just a few. And then I think for visual artists, I've always been a huge fan of Egon Schiele's and Gustav Klimt, rather. A lot of people tell me that my drawings kind of look a little bit like their figures.
I can see that.
Gaunt and sickly and nervous or sad. Yeah.
I remember reading Zadie Smith's White Teeth. I think I was like 19 and being on the train, like a 7-hour train ride, and reading the entire thing and just being blown away. Her work is just phenomenal.
It is. And she actually, when I was teaching at Bronx Prep, which is a prep school in the South Bronx, I taught there for 1 year, a couple of years back. I taught White Teeth, and I was able to get her to come in and have a discussion with me in front of the class. 85 students and the administration. Everybody was starstruck and really appreciative. I mean, how often do you get to teach a novel at high school and then have the author come in to talk about the work?
Wow.
It was so much fun, and she was a great sport. She called it a blessing.
Oh, really nice. That's so lovely. So let's talk a little bit about your teaching. You taught across the country in various different settings, created courses around sexuality and gender health. How has that experience kind of informed your creative path? And what does art allow you to do that perhaps you couldn't do in the classroom?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, as a teacher, you kind of have to watch your P's and Q's, certainly as a high school teacher. And you have to abide by the curriculum for the most part on a high school level. I taught for 2 years, though, at Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona. I taught human sexuality, psychology of gender, and introduction to psychology. And you have a little bit more license to sort of say what you want and to integrate creative and critical and conceptual thinking into the curriculum and share from personal experiences. I was able to talk about myself as a gay man, and it was pertinent to the subject matter. And because such a large section of those courses deal with sexuality and gender. And I think so much of my creative work deals with sexuality and gender. at least at the college level, I felt that a lot of what I was teaching was great background or research for what I was writing. And whenever I had the opportunity, I would try to share my films or writing without seeming narcissistic about it with my students. And I think they appreciated that only because it was coming from a personal space.
Mm.
You know,
there's this kind of common misconception that gender identity and expression is linked to sexuality or romantic attraction. How do we, as a community, I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community, how do we better inform and educate folks?
I think it's extremely important. I think as artists, we have a great vantage point from which to do that. And I think we kind of have a moral responsibility to do it too, frankly, without ever getting on a soap dish. And I said, no, you don't have to do that necessarily, but we have, I really do think, and this research has supported this, that creative storytelling, at least, is able to enhance empathy and understanding more effectively than, say, nonfiction writing, or preaching, or journalism, or politics. So we're educators on some level. We're teaching empathy, really. And I think that you do that by illustrating, by showing, rather than just telling or finger wagging. I think you could almost be like subversive about it, like sneak it in, as a theme or a moral.
When I think about it, we do stand kind of on the shoulder of giants in terms of those who have advanced LGBTQ rights. Marsha P. Johnson, Harvey Milk, Edie Windsor. We can all reel off the names of these characters. But like you said, it's often the storytellers that impact people's hearts and change people's minds. Who are some of those perhaps LGBTQ storytellers that have really guided your beliefs and motivations?
Tony Kushner, right off the bat. Angels in America. I read it when I was 19, and it changed everything for me. And I came out pretty late. I was 28 before I finally came out of the closet. Before that, I had been with women. I had dated women. And I think it was probably, and I hate to say this because it sounds a little bit corny and cliche, but it is the truth. Brokeback Mountain had come out. And I was
Power of art.
Serious, and I was so moved by that film and so angry with myself that it just sort of thrust me out of the closet and helped. It sort of buoyed me on some level. But Edmund White's work, for sure. Jean Genet. Genet is great as a playwright. Wrote The Maids, The Balcony, and Our Lady of the Flowers, the novel. And Edmund wrote like the definitive biography of him, on him.
Wow.
His work was just so ferocious and so fearless and almost radical and militant and unapologetic. Nothing maudlin, nothing sort of at all sappy, and just tough. And I saw, wow, you can really effectuate change as a playwright or as a fiction writer or as a filmmaker. God, the list goes on and on, though. Adrienne Rich's poetry, her contribution was so great that when I finally had an excerpt from my novel, The Unmentionable Man, published in Bloom, a journal that had previously published her work, it felt like kind of a major victory.
That was your aha moment.
Yeah, and that was 2015.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about your coming out story. I don't think I've ever heard. I didn't realize it was so late in your 20s.
Yeah. It was just a sort of very casual thing that happened. I met someone online, and we had a couple of dates, and it quickly became a relationship. It didn't end up lasting very long, but it made me realize. So when I finally did come out, of course, it wasn't a big deal.
Did we lose the feed? Oh, I think we're frozen on Facebook, but I think we're still good on Instagram. Let's just check.
We're still good on Instagram. So should we wait?
Yeah, let's carry on.
We're back.
Okay. So you're 28. Yep.
nobody blinked. Everybody was okay with it. They were really accepting, and I think a lot of people were just sort of like, I wish you had felt safer to come out sooner.
What was it that prevented you? What was the struggle?
I don't know. I guess the fear of judgment or rejection or making people feel awkward. There's a lot of silly things that I think we care about, first of all, when we're younger. We shouldn't care about those things, first of all. and then also just not, I think, trusting the people that I cared about. Or not knowing the people that I thought I knew.
Right. And I talked about this the other day recently with another LGBTQ artist, Chick Byrne. I felt very fortunate to move about the world and be able to pass as a straight woman. So it was never really a question,
Right.
Until it was a question that I had to face myself.
Sure.
I would imagine that you probably had a similar experience, that you were not immediately, obviously, a gay man.
No.
How did that affect you?
I think it made me. I think so. When I was in junior high school, I was briefly bullied for being a little bit effeminate, and I think that made me very hyper self-conscious of my manner and of my voice and of how I carried myself. And I think on some level I constructed something, to be perfectly honest, and that construction ended up sticking, and I carried it with me into adulthood. And so it didn't necessarily change when I came out, because manner, affect, or sexual orientation are all very different things, and I guess it did force me to finally then do the work and say the words, and not just assume that people were making assumptions. To assume that people were making assumptions.
Yeah. When you talked about characters that you were reading about LGBTQ stories before you came out, what did that give you?
I think in the back of my mind, I knew I always was going to come out. I just didn't know when. And I think that a lot of this art and a lot of the work, a lot of the stories were almost like ammunition for when it finally happened. I was sort of gearing up for something. So I was trying to consume as much literature, as many films, and as much visual art as I could to sort of gird, because if it was on some level, I thought, well, if my personal social circles had a problem with any of this, at least all of these great historical artists are on my side, and who cares what everybody else thinks then? You have legends on your side, it doesn't matter so much what regular people say. At least that was the case I was making for myself at the time in my head.
I mean, I admire your level of self-acceptance that it must have taken to actively say those words out loud. I often think, I was kind of outed at 17, so I didn't get the opportunity to say those words. And I wonder sometimes, was that a blessing? Like, was it a blessing that I was able to come out at 17 and live my life authentically? Or would it have been a conversation that I would have ever had the confidence to sit down and have? Do you feel that at the moment that you were able to say those words to your loved ones, that you had that total self-acceptance and were ready to live in your truth?
I think so. And I think it came from a level of frustration and impatience. Like, oh my God, I'm going to be 30 in 2 years. I'm wasting time. The clock is ticking. And so those sensations were able to override any kind of uncertainty I had about the reactions of the people I cared about. It sort of happened in a fever,
So, you mentioned that a lot of your work has focused around the LGBTQ community, around gender issues. How important is visibility to you today? How do you move around about the world as a gay man?
I'm almost not even conscious of it anymore, and I think that's probably because I live in New York and I feel comfortable there and safe. When I was in Arizona, I mean, Tucson's a very progressive city, but the rest of the state, as we know, is pretty conservative, I think, and especially being there when Donald Trump became president, it was a little bit frightening, and it definitely suddenly became something I was very conscious of at all times. But I don't think I give it a second thought in New York, and I realize that you'll find bigots anywhere, right, including Manhattan, including Manhattan 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't worry about it. I'll still hold my husband's hand in public. I'll still kiss him in public. It's fear never kind of informs any of the decisions I make about how I express my love for him. And certainly, so many of the books I've written, or short stories or essays I've written, are queer themed, and I've had public readings, and I feel perfectly safe doing that. I mean, they're usually, obviously within queer spaces, so it's you're feeling buttressed, right? You're feeling lifted by the community.
So, we are in this time of just complete uncertainty. There's such polarization between the two sides right now. There really isn't any room for that gray area. We talked briefly about touching people's heart through storytelling and sharing the experience and putting a human face to an issue. How do you think that we can do that when folks are so polarized? How do we bring people to the table who, have these opposing views?
Well, I think we need to get to the root of the problem. And I don't know, again, people have said this already, that Trump is a symptom. He wasn't just grown overnight. There was obviously a mentality in the country that allowed him to become president. And I think we need to work on that, sort of get to the root of the disease, or the root of the virus, as it were, before we're able to just say, well, it's just a matter of voting him out of office, because the sentiment is still there. So, I think, again, this might sound a little bit sort of like twee, but there's shows like Will and Grace helped. Shows like Schitt's Creek helps. Having a figure like Rachel Maddow helps. Anderson Cooper helps. These things that are very, of course, pop and large and commercial help. And I certainly don't think we should ever kind of be tearing them down or dismissing them because they happen to work within a corporate strata. They are doing work that is gaining visibility, and on a small day-to-day level, they are kind of helping us win hearts and minds. That's not to say that there shouldn't be room for also radical art and radical expression, and an almost kind of a aggressive militant vibe that I think that sometimes our community is afraid of expressing. We want to be so nice and likable all the time, and I think that's fine, but that limits us, I think, as a human. Gay people are allowed to be angry, we're allowed to be aggressive, we're allowed to want to fight. We shouldn't have to always be so permissive. And I think figures like Larry Kramer, who wrote the book Faggots and the play The Normal Heart, and who with Edmund White helped co-found the gay men's health crisis in the early 80s. He's been incredibly angry, and still, and rightly so. And I think that we should continue to be vigilant and continue to demand that we're treated as whole people, not just as caricatures or cliches. And I wrote an article for Penk a year ago about this, about representation in media, whereas once upon a time we were villains, or we were, weak victims, and now we are saints. And I'm not sure either representation is great. I think that we should be characters that are whole, that are both saintly and also villainous, that are profound and also petty, like any other character.
And I think we're seeing right now in the community, we have advanced in so many ways, certainly for, LGBTQ folks or LGB folks, there's a lot more stability. We're looking at the likes of the trans community, the non-binary, the queer folks, the people of color, really seeing a lot of rights roll back and a lot of negativity. What responsibility do we have in the community as members of the community to not rest on our laurels, to be out there advocating? What do you think that should look like?
We do have a great responsibility. At this point, we're almost now becoming not just, LGB, but now also allies on some We need to also be allies. I feel like white cis gay people should be allies to trans and gender fluid, gender queer, and people of color, uh, individuals within the queer community. We're now moving into a dual role of not just advocating for ourselves, because we've made significant advancements in the last 20 years. There's no doubt about it. But the fact of the matter is, I'm still cisgendered. I'm still white. And I have a moral responsibility to now advocate on behalf of trans individuals, people of color who are also in the gay community. I don't think we should just sit back and say, "Oh, we've done it. Our work is, complete here. We're comfortable." I think that would expose us as frauds and hypocrites.
Mm. And there's still quite a vocal level of homophobia out there in the media. Just recently, I was watching David LaChapelle's comedy special, and he referred to us as the letter people.
Yeah.
How damaging is that today?
I think we have to sort of be careful not to. There wasn't really too much of an outcry, as I remember, over that. There was some grousing, but it was quickly dismissed. I think that, on the one hand, it's important to have a sense of humor and to be able to take a joke and not take everything too seriously. But on the other, I think it's especially important that any kind of marginalized people have each other's back, as I just said. That one of the things that used to drive me crazy when I was teaching psychology of gender and human sexuality in Tucson is that I would have students from one marginalized community criticizing individuals from another marginalized community. And I said, don't you understand that we're basically all on the same side, that we should all be supporting one another and holding each other up, that it's not okay to try to somehow mainstream ourselves into bigots of the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of, again, it's hypocritical, and it makes us out to be frauds. I'm not saying that David Chappelle is a fraud, but I'm just saying that maybe that kind of humor where now the other is being in any way denigrated or reduced should be at least reconsidered. Like, what's the goal? What are you trying to do? What is the end game? And how is it serving you? I mean, you might think, well, it's just a joke, but that joke can hurt somebody.
Mm-hmm. I can laugh at the comedic element of it, but my concern is always the children, like the young voices that are coming up. Like, I remember being that 16-year-old 15-year-old kid watching television and seeing derogatory things and thinking, I don't have a place in this world. And I would hate for any young person to see that.
Yes.
And it be damaging for them.
Oh God, yeah. No, I agree. And I saw it at the high school level when I was teaching, and even in New York. A lot of times you would hear the occasional slur or the occasional joke, and I would, and then you find yourself as an educator in a tricky position. Do you call the student out right then and there and make it a talking point? Does that only make the situation worse? Does it make the student who is being made fun of in the moment feel extra awkward? I mean, certainly I always addressed it. I never let it go. But then it was always a matter of making a split-second decision. Do I pull the student who made the remark aside and talk to him or her privately? Also, because if you, especially with teenagers, if you call them out in front of their peers, they then become very egotistical and defensive because you shame them. So they don't always necessarily hear the message, but the message has to be sent one way or the other.
What kind of tone were you seeing from the young folks coming through that when you were teaching, such a divisive hot topic as gender and sexuality? What are these folks like that are coming up?
Well, in Tucson, they were all college students, so they ranged from 18 to like 65. Most of them were in their mid to late 20s. It was a community college, a commuter school. Most of them worked. They were, very open. They were very accepting. They were very curious. They were very compassionate. And then you had those few who pushed back and thought that a lot of what I was teaching was academic, political correctness. And I would then have to turn that into a discussion and say, well, what you view as political correctness translates to actual safety and respect for other communities. you might feel inconvenienced because you can't make a certain joke or you can't make a certain comment. But what about the individuals whose dignity and lives and freedoms are literally actually on the line every day? And you're not helping matters with your position. But I would never take a scolding tone. I would never try to talk down to anybody. I would always try to turn it into a logical conversation. It's always, well, okay, this is your position. Why do you have it? Where did it come from? And what use is it? And is it serving you? And are you ever concerned about people outside of your social circle or community or demographic?
What was the response like generally?
I mean, generally it was effective. Sometimes it would turn into a cup of coffee after class, where I would sit in the cafeteria with the student for an extra hour or two, just talking to them about my life, my experiences, and my friends, and statistics. Case studies. Case studies go a long way. Statistics are kind of cold. The number might be shocking, but I found that by making it human, it makes it relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's where empathy is built.
Right. In the story.
In the stories. So
let's talk a little bit about your creative practice. What is your favorite part of the process?
Oh gosh. I love sort of trying to actualize ideas, right? So I'll have an idea, I'll write it down, I'll let it sit for a few days or a few weeks or a few hours, depending on what it is. And then I like to try to challenge myself to see how close I can get to actualizing what that original enzyme was. And I mean, for me, it's, I quickly do a sketch or I quickly write a first draft, and then I spend hours or days or weeks or even years sometimes refining and polishing and revising and enhancing. And that is also great fun to me, is trying to just make the work as good as it could be. It's almost like writing is a lot like sculpting. You kind of quickly create a very crude, rough outline, and then you spend a lot of time kind of finessing it and polishing it, as it were.
How does it feel when you have spent this time refining and mining into this idea to finally bring it to the world?
It's a combination of fulfilling and also really depressing, because now the work is done and it almost seems like for a moment you don't have a purpose. Of course, it's very momentary until the next idea comes along. But I think there's always that kind of constant craving where you want to just keep coming up with ideas and keep expressing those ideas and keep refining those ideas and sharing them. Then ultimately, that's another great joy for me, is getting feedback from people.
Roxane Gay, I recently listened to a podcast of her being interviewed by her partner, Debbie Millman. And she talked about how, handling criticism, how really we don't have, well, we shouldn't have an attachment to the work once we let it go.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that. I've tried, I really have. It's difficult. I know that everybody has their own subjectivity and their own opinion and their own taste. And I can sort of accept criticism on that level. Or if the criticism is constructive and it's, during and throughout the process, I'm very open to it and very accepting of it. But if it's a sort of dismissive criticism that is sort of mindless, I think I tend to get defensive. But
do you find that your skin has thickened over time?
Oh yeah, God yeah. Especially as a writer, you become a master of accepting rejections. It's like 85% rejection.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. How do you, we live in this society right now where, there are these trolls, shall we call them, that hide behind a keyboard anonymously, that, of course, that want to offer their 2 cents or, give negative feedback to people who are actually having the boldness and the audacity to put out their ideas into the world. How do you handle that, or have you had any experience of that?
So I was just joking with my husband the other day because I saw that a bunch of my literary reviews for Newsday appeared on Reddit. And so, so I have all these anonymous people discussing my writing on Reddit, which is on the one hand really satisfying because it's like, oh, I've arrived. I've become like Reddit fodder.
Trolls love it.
Yeah, trolls hate me. Yay. But
Uh,
it was annoying me because a lot of their criticisms were unfounded and inaccurate. And I so badly wanted to comment and correct them. My husband was like, no, do not do that. It's like, maybe I can get a friend to do it.
See, this is why we have right. I'm assuming your husband is a right brain person or a left brain.
Well, what's interesting about him is his background is in musical theater. He's this great singer, actor, dancer. He's very talented. He's very much a performer, but he's also very, very practical. So he's a general manager now for a telecommunications company, and requires a lot of right brain, analytical, rational thinking. So
I can relate because obviously, my wife is an attorney, and she's been my just a wonderful person to have around when those kind of negative comments come in, because like you, I want to defend my work. I want to, tell them that they're wrong. And she'll say, no, there's no point. Just
leave it.
Leave it alone.
Oh, that's so hard to do though.
It is, because I think you feel so closely attached to what you put out into the world. I know from knowing you several years that you put heart and soul into your work. So when you do put it out to the world, it's like putting out your baby.
Yeah, exactly. And truly, and for people who don't have babies or children, it is, at least as far as I'm concerned, my version of a child or children. And you get protective.
Right. If it's being picked on in the playground, I'm going to jump in and defend it.
Yeah.
So the idea of the artist is, always kind of brings to mind this solitude figure working on their painting, in isolation. Do you find that you go to that place or need to go to that place? And is there an element of loneliness that comes with that?
I think I've gotten used to it. I do need to go to that place. And I do think that I've gotten used to it. And my husband has been very patient with me. Because sometimes it's not easy. He would like for me to sit and watch TV with him, or he would like for me to go to the park. And I do. I try really hard to balance. But I also do need a lot of alone time. I do need a lot of solitude just to get the work done. Especially when I'm writing, because I do need to be able to concentrate on what I'm trying to express. And I do yearn to be precise, and that does take a certain amount of concentration, and I can't kind of do that when the TV is on and when there's people around. And I think in the beginning it would give me panic attacks in my 20s, but I've gotten better at it now. And intermittently I'll do yoga, or I'll go running, or I'll clean. I'll start cleaning the apartment, and it sort of clears the cobwebs. Or I'll binge a TV show, something to break the monotony. But it's completely necessary.
How important is discipline in your creative practice?
It's so important. If I'm really good at anything, I'll say I'm good at that, is creating a structure and abiding by it. Almost like fascistic. It's like, I don't care what happens in the world, from 2 to 5 I'm writing, or from 10 to 12 I'm drawing, and that's it. And I'll ignore phone calls, and and but since I work from home now, I have to kind of figure out how to finesse that where I'm not being negligent in my duties. If it's a weekday and I need to get a certain amount of work done, because a lot of my writing projects are on deadline. Obviously, Interview, Newsday, the film that I'm editing, and the feature-length screenplay that's based on it. There are deliverable dates that producers and financiers and editors and publishers expect. So that also then starts to become work too. The drawings, not so much. Those are for me, and that's perhaps why I've really enjoyed doing them these past 6 weeks. It was like 6 weeks ago, and then there was nothing, and then there was a bunch over the course of a week and a half. So it's the quarantine productivity period, I guess. The QPP.
The QPP. I wonder what this era will be named.
I know.
I've seen a few suggestions that are interesting out there. The Great Realization.
The Great Realization. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of, COVID-19 related art over the next year or two, and a lot of movies for sure. I hope that a lot of it is thematic.
Mm.
And I think that's when it gets more interesting, when we're exploring what the virus stands for. The virus as America, the virus as Trumpism, the virus as capitalism. And I think that's what a lot of the work I'm trying to do now is trying to speak to, not the virus literally, not quarantine literally, but isolation as a theme,
Mm-hmm.
alienation as a theme, and then viral things as a theme, like conservatism, or again, capitalism, or indifference, or egotism, selfishness, all of these things that can become virally thematic, thematically viral.
I think the one thing for me that it has become really visceral is it's challenging us to rethink what we value.
Yes.
Both in society, in our own kind of small little worlds that we, walk through. Like just something as simple as having time to be, not be running 100 different places.
I think so too. I think this has given us all an opportunity to sort of regroup and reassess and revisit ourselves and our interests and people that we love and care about. Maybe we needed this pause.
Mm-hmm.
I know the impact has been horrific, but it's also been maybe necessary.
It's also showing us who is valuable in society.
Yes.
These essential workers.
Yes.
I mean, folks that are literally keeping the country going right now are not the 1%. They're not these big corporations. They're the, frontline workers. Your mail
workers, mailmen, firefighters, cops, doctors, nurses. Their work is almost sacred, on some level.
My parents own a small kind of corner shop, you would call it, in the UK, and it's been really in Southport. And it's been really failing just because of these big corporations. These huge Tesco's and Asda and the superstores, like kind of the equivalent to Walmart. They've been struggling for years, and it's now that they are seeing this. Just they have the ability to be of service. First of all, they're delivering to the elderly. They're busier than they've ever been because folks need that local grocery store. So they've almost seen a revival, which is amazing.
We ordered food for the first time in 2 months. That's wonderful to hear. I'm happy to hear that about your parents, Rachel, and that the work that they're doing has been so robust and fulfilling. And we ordered food for the first time on Tuesday night, and the young man who picked up the phone on the other end was so excited to tell us that our order was going to be 2 hours late because suddenly they're just so busy.
Wow.
An explosion of orders, and we were like, "That's great. That's fine. Don't worry about it. We'll nosh on something till the food comes." We were just so happy to hear that a local business was that busy suddenly.
It's interesting times. So, what would you say has been the most fulfilling and rewarding of your creative accomplishments thus far?
Oh boy, gosh. Afghan Hound, my feature film, which I wrote and directed 10 years ago, is probably the most challenging creative thing I had ever done. And it probably remains my most fulfilling. I'm very proud of the New Engagement, the literary journal, mainly because it's giving platform and voice to so many great artists and writers around the world, really. We get submissions from all over the world, throughout South America, throughout Europe, throughout East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then across the United States as well. And I'm really excited about this new project, The Saintly Madness. The short film really came out beautifully, and I'm really excited about the script that I'm writing based on it. And I guess I'm also really pleased with my novel, The Unmentionable Man, which Conception helped launch in 2015. You guys served as the forum for my book release party.
That was a lot of fun.
It was so much fun. Yeah.
Do you feel, and I imagine this applies to folks who work across the disciplines in art, but do you ever feel that you've already created your best work?
Sometimes I think I do, and that gives me mixed feelings. It's sort of like a relief on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a little bit sad or unnerving. And I did think that, honestly, until I started working on this new project. And I feel like this, if it's not my best work, it'll be as good as my best work.
Mm.
Yeah.
And where do you draw your inspiration and your ideas from today? What's kind of your go-to?
Oh boy. Well, currently it's probably the pandemic, and again, and all the thematic ideas that can be explored around it. Before that, it was not Trump specifically. I'm not that interested in him, but I'm fascinated by the ideologies that engendered him. So I think for the 3 or 4 years before this, it was probably that. Um, social class divide has always been an engine for me. Uh, Narcissism and egotism, capitalism, these have always been interests of mine. And then, the relationships that I have with people that I care very much about. And I start to look closer at the nature of those relationships. I start to learn more about myself. And so I think my work is becoming increasingly autobiographical, which is kind of interesting to me. And I think I'm actually working on a memoir at a certain point too, focusing specifically on a certain facet of my personality and how it relates to men in my life, whether they're friends or past lovers or my husband or my father, my brother, childhood friends. Yeah, that's sort of come up in the last 2 months too. So a lot of self-reflection.
It's a good time for it.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, folks, we're going to take some questions in about 5 minutes or so. So if you do have any questions for Brian, do jump into the comments, either on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, and we will, of course, get to you. Brian, how would you say your practice has evolved over time?
My process?
Your practice, in approach to all the various disciplines of art that you practice.
I think that when I first started out, I was responding more to artists that I really admired, almost having an imaginary conversation with them. And now it's become a conversation that I'm having with friends and family and people in my intimate circles. And I mean, that's more the impetus, isn't it? But so the process, though, I don't think the process itself has changed. I'm still very much about quickly banging out a rough draft or sketch and then taking my time building and developing it. I need something visual to work with, even if it's a horribly written first draft, or a really sloppy sketch. I just need something visual in front of me to pry something loose and to help me think. Joan Didion once said, "I don't think very well unless it's on paper." She would write so many drafts because the more she would write, the more she would be able to figure out what it is she was trying to do or say. And I could relate to that.
So tell us a little bit about the new engagement.
The new engagement, this July, will make it 4. It's going to have its birthday in mid-July. We put out 2 print issues, and in late June, early July, we'll put out our 18th online issue. We mainly focus on writers of color, people in the LGBTQI community, women. We do, of course, have plenty of straight white men as well. But those are our focal points, as the sort of marginalized voice. And we have everything from photography to illustration to painting to graphic design to even music, short films, short stories, essays, poetry collections, novel excerpts, memoir. It's a pretty wide range of literature and art. And I co-founded it with my ex and still good friend, Lupe Rodarte. You've met.
Of course.
Yeah. And he manages operations and I'm the editor. So it's really a 2-man army.
Very cool. What do you hope to accomplish with the publication?
We hope to grow it. We hope that it continues to expand and earn readers and viewers. We hope to continue to give platform to writers and artists who might not be able to get into the mainstream journals or who have not yet had an exhibit. We hope that it gives them a jumping off point, or even something that they could put on their resume to help them get some attention, to help, I hate to use this term, but legitimize them in the eyes of editors or curators.
Wonderful. We have a lot of work to do when it comes to that, for sure. So, I praise you for taking the stance that you are, and giving that platform and giving a voice to these folks.
My pleasure, and thank you as well, because you're doing the same thing.
Awesome. All right, so let's take some questions. Well, Rachel Romano, first of all, loved the drawings. We got some love here. Jan, you named some fabulous and obviously influential male artists who've inspired you. Who are the female artists, writers, and artists that have empowered you? Well, you did mention Zadie Smith.
Zadie Smith. So for the writers, it's certainly, it's Virginia Woolf. It is Margaret Atwood. It is Mary Gateskill. It is Joy Williams. It is the Bronte sisters going back. Mary Shelley. And then for artists, Georgia O'Keeffe is remarkable. A huge fan of Frida Kahlo's work growing up. For the filmmakers, Lena Wertmuller is remarkable. Jane Campion is great. Lucrecia Martel, who's this amazing Argentinian filmmaker. She made The Headless Woman. So many. I mean, I think especially when it comes to writing, I probably read more female writers than male writers, generally speaking.
Fantastic. All right, Brian. So tell us what's next and where people can learn more about you. And we will pop a website link or some kind of link in the comments so people can go learn more about you.
Sure. Well, I guess if you want to check out the quarantine series that I've been talking about, those 7 drawings, they're on my Facebook page and they're in my Instagram page as well. And then the film is The Saintly Madness. We'll be posting the short soon, probably in the next couple of weeks. The feature we hope to shoot somehow in the fall. We'll see if social distancing gets in the way. It's a chamber piece, only 2 actors, 1 location, so it's feasible. We might be able to do it. If not, we'd have to probably shoot next summer. And then, of course, Newsday and Interview Magazine continues to publish my interviews and book reviews. And I think Turtle Point Press Magazine is going to be publishing an interview with me and Michael Carroll next week.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Brian, thank you. It was such a pleasure to hang out and sip coffee and chat with you and learn what you've been up to. So thank you so much. I love the Damien Hirst cup as well. Very nice.
Yeah, of course.
A little lame this morning, but thank you so much. It was a great pleasure having you on the show. So thank you everybody for listening. We will be back in tomorrow, same time, 11 a.m. for Coffee with Artists. Thank you so much.